Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. They say some houses keep secrets buried beneath their foundations, stories too dark to tell and too restless to stay silent. This is one of those stories. A woman moved into what seemed like the perfect home, unaware of the ground it stood upon. Decades earlier, there was no quiet suburban street here, only the looming walls of Ridgeview Asylum, a place where lost minds were hidden from the world. And among its patients was a man known only as Patient 43, a man haunted by voices commanding him to knock, every night, without fail. Staff said they heard the knocking too, through walls, through floors, even when he was tied to his bed. When the asylum burned and the land was cleared, his story was forgotten. But some say you can still hear him knocking softly in the night. This is not just a ghost story. It's a chilling reminder that some echoes never fade. As you listen, remember, he knocked to keep the voices at bay. And if the sound reaches you, 3 soft taps in the dead of night, you must not ignore it. Because Patient 43 believed that once the knocking stops, something far worse slips through. Tonight we tell his story, but be warned, once you hear it, you may never unhear the knocking again. There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel natural, the sort that doesn't comfort, but instead presses against your chest like a heavy weight. She noticed it the first week in her new home, though at the time she told herself it was simply the adjustment period. New houses often had their own sounds, their own moods, their own ways of settling into the lives of those who dared inhabit them. But this silence wasn't the creak of old pipes or the sigh of shifting beams. It was deeper. A silence that seemed to listen. At night, it became oppressive. She would lie awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince herself that the unease pressing against her ribs was nothing more than exhaustion. But on the 7th night, that silence broke, not with a crash or a scream, but with 3 soft knocks on the far wall of her bedroom. Tap, tap, tap. They were slow, deliberate, almost polite. She held her breath, unsure if she'd imagined them, and waited for them to come again. The room stretched into a tense void. Minutes passed. Nothing. Her rational mind offered easy explanations. A branch in the wind, an old pipe releasing air. But deep down, somewhere behind the steady drum of her heartbeat, a whisper suggested something else, something waiting. The next night, it happened again. At precisely 3:07 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. The same rhythm, the same wall. This time she sat up in bed, clutching the edge of her blanket as if the thin fabric could shield her from whatever lingered behind the plaster. The knocks were faint, but purposeful, not random, not accidental. She tiptoed to the wall, pressing her ear against the cool surface. Silence. For a moment she wondered if she should knock back, but her hand froze in mid-air. Something about the sound felt wrong, as if responding would be an invitation. She retreated to her bed and stayed there, staring at the wall, until the first rays of dawn softened the darkness. When morning came, she laughed nervously at herself. She told a friend over the phone about the noise, forcing a light tone into her voice. "It's probably just the house settling," she said. But her words didn't feel true, even to her own ears. That night, she placed her phone on the nightstand, voice recorder running. She wanted proof. The next morning she played back the recording. For hours there was nothing but the faint rustle of bedsheets and her own soft breathing. Then at exactly 3:07 a.m., there it was. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharper on the recording than she remembered, hollow and deliberate. Her breath caught as she listened to it, loop over and over again. She turned the volume to maximum and pressed the speaker to her ear. On the third replay, she heard something faint beneath the knocks. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Keep knocking, keep knocking." Her stomach dropped. She yanked out her headphones and stared at her phone, as if it might spring to life in her hand. That day she couldn't stop thinking about the voice. She searched online for the house's history. It had been built only 20 years earlier. But the land, what about the land? A few clicks led her to an archive of city planning records. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad as she scrolled past zoning maps and property deeds. Then she found it, a grainy black and white photo of a sprawling brick complex, labeled Ridgeview Asylum, circa 1965. The asylum had been demolished decades ago, but she could see the street names on the map. Her house now sat precisely where the east wing had once been. The description below the photo sent a chill down her spine. Wing destroyed in 1973 fire. Area deemed unstable. Reconstruction delayed for years. She slammed her laptop shut, her hands trembling. It was just an old building, she told herself. History didn't matter. But when the night came, she couldn't bring herself to turn off the lights. At 3:07 a.m., the knocks came again. Louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. She flinched. The sound seemed closer, sharper. She gripped the edge of her blanket so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The whispers followed. Faint, urgent. Don't let them in. Don't stop knocking. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the sound faded, leaving only silence behind. But this silence felt different now, thicker, heavier, like it wasn't just silence at all, but the held breath of something unseen. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning arrived, she stared at the bedroom wall and whispered to herself, "It's just a dream, just a dream." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The next day, she went back to the archives. She had to know more. The asylum records were harder to find, buried behind login walls and forgotten databases. But after hours of searching, she stumbled upon a forum where local historians shared scanned documents from Ridgeview's patient files. One entry caught her eye, patient #43, male, admitted in 1968. Diagnosis: auditory hallucinations, severe. She clicked the file and read the notes, her pulse pounding. Subject claims voices instruct him to knock nightly. Refusal results in severe anxiety and panic attacks. Reports of staff hearing unexplained knocking in East Wing. Her hands trembled as she scrolled further. Patient insists, "They told me to keep knocking. If I stop, they'll come through." The final note was dated March 3, 1973. Patient found unresponsive. Cause of death: self-inflicted wounds. Incident coincides with East Wing fire. She shut her laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes. That night, the knocks returned. But this time there were 4, not 3. Tap, 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 tap. Each one echoed louder than the last, vibrating through the floorboards. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the sound drilled into her skull. She couldn't help it. She whispered into the darkness, "What do you want?" A voice answered from the wall, "Your turn." There was no sleep that night. She sat curled in the corner of her bed, knees drawn tight to her chest, as the word echoed again and again in her head. Your turn. It wasn't a hallucination. It couldn't have been. The voice was too clear, too present, as if it had leaned close to the other side of the wall to whisper directly into her ear. She had tried to rationalize it, clinging desperately to logic, like a drowning person clutches driftwood. Stress, perhaps, or some strange bleed-through from a dream into her waking mind. But even as she told herself these things, the air in the room felt heavy, thick, like smoke, impossible to breathe without effort. Her eyes darted to the clock. 3:12 a.m. The knocking had stopped 5 minutes ago, but its echo lingered in her ears, her chest, her very bones. She told herself again and again, wait for daylight. It will go with the sun. But part of her knew the darkness wasn't the problem. The problem was the house. The next day she stayed away as long as she could. She wandered aimlessly through shops, sat in cafes staring blankly at her coffee, trying to convince herself there was nothing waiting at home for her. But each time her phone buzzed in her pocket, she jumped. It was as if the house had left a piece of itself inside her, pulling her back. By evening she was driving in slow circles through the neighborhood, dreading the moment she'd see her front door. She lingered in the car long after parking, gripping the steering wheel tight enough for her knuckles to ache. Finally the streetlight flickered, and she told herself firmly that she was being ridiculous. Houses didn't haunt people. She walked inside quickly, leaving all the lights on, as she moved from room to room. Everything looked the same, silent, still, harmless. She forced dinner down, avoiding the bedroom, until her eyes grew heavy. She almost believed she'd been overreacting. That night the knocking returned, as she knew it would. But this time, it wasn't confined to the wall. It moved. Tap, 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 starting from the far corner of her bedroom and slowly traveling toward the head of her bed. Each knock was deliberate, impossibly steady, like someone following a precise rhythm only they could hear. She held her breath as the sound reached the foot of her bed, her body paralyzed with fear. The final knock was so close, she swore she could feel the vibrations against her pillow. Silence followed, heavy, suffocating. She squeezed her eyes shut, clutching her blanket like a lifeline. But a faint voice broke the stillness again. This time, it was clearer than ever. Keep knocking. Don't stop, or they'll come. She opened her eyes to pitch darkness, her fingers trembling. The air smelled faintly of smoke. The next morning she returned to the archive site, her hands clammy as she scrolled past dozens of patient files. She needed to know more about patient 43. The entry had been sparse, clinical, just enough to terrify her. She found a supplemental file with staff reports from 1970. A note written in hurried pen read, "Patient exhibits extreme distress when not allowed to knock. Reports auditory hallucinations, instructing him to maintain nightly ritual to prevent them from entering. Staff report hearing knocks at all hours, even when patient under sedation." Another report, East Wing staff complain of sleeplessness due to incessant knocking. When investigated, sound ceases abruptly. Audio recordings fail to capture phenomenon. She felt a sick twist in her stomach as she read the final line in the file. Patient claims failure to knock allows voices to manifest physically. Believes prior staff deaths linked to this neglect. That night she tried a desperate experiment. Just before 3:07 a.m., she placed her hand against the wall where the knocking usually began. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she whispered, "I'll knock for you." She tapped 3 times softly, her knuckles barely grazing the plaster. Tap, tap, tap. Silence followed. For a moment she allowed herself to exhale, thinking maybe this was all patient 43 had wanted, someone to continue his ritual. But then it came, the answering knock, louder than ever. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart lurched into her throat. She stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of her bed. The knocks followed her, hammering from wall to wall, floor to ceiling, surrounding her in a cage of sound. And beneath it all, a low whisper, "Not enough, not enough." The next day she packed a bag. She didn't care if she looked foolish. She couldn't spend another night in that house. She booked a hotel across town and left just as the sun began to set. As she drove away, she felt the weight on her chest ease for the first time in weeks. Maybe distance was the answer. Maybe the knocking would stop if she wasn't there to hear it. She didn't know if the ritual required proximity or merely awareness, but she prayed it was the former. She checked into her room, double-locked the door, and let herself sink into the mattress. But at 3:07 a.m., a sound came from the hotel room's far wall. Tap, tap, tap. At first, she thought she was dreaming. That same slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed impossible, absurd even, that the sound could follow her here. She had left the house miles behind. Different walls, different floorboards, different air entirely. Yet there it was, echoing faintly through the paper-thin walls of the hotel room. She pressed a pillow over her head, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst through her ribs. The knocks grew louder, closer, as if crossing impossible distances to reach her. On the third set, she bolted upright in bed and shouted, "Stop it. Just stop." But silence was not her reward. Instead, a whisper, so close she felt its breath on her cheek. "If you stop, they'll come." The morning was a blur of exhaustion and denial. She told herself she'd been caught in that strange half-dream state, where sounds from the day seep into night terrors. But as she sipped her coffee with trembling hands, her phone vibrated. A notification from the house's security system. Motion detected at 3:07 a.m. She opened the video feed and felt her blood turn to ice. The camera in her bedroom showed nothing but an empty room. Lights off, shadows deep. But the audio track, she didn't want to believe it. Yet she couldn't deny what she heard. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was faint but distinct. Her vision swam as the whisper bled through again, tinny but unmistakable, even through her phone's tiny speaker. "Your turn." She nearly dropped the device. Panic clawed at her rational mind. She didn't want to go back to the house. Not ever, but something deep within whispered that the knocking would not stop, simply because she had left. Patient 43 hadn't escaped by running, had he? He had stayed. He had knocked. And still something had come for him in the end. The image of his file flashed in her memory. The words scrawled in the margins. Refusal results in panic. Hallucinations. Possible external manifestations. What did that mean? What had they seen? She told herself she was not like him. She didn't hear voices. She didn't see things that weren't there. But in her peripheral vision, a shadow seemed to twitch and flinch each time her mind drifted to the sound. She rubbed her eyes raw, but when she looked again, the corner was empty. That night, in the hotel room, she sat awake with her phone clutched tightly in her hands. She set an alarm for 3:06 a.m., determined to act before the knocking could start. When it rang, she pressed her knuckles to the wall and knocked. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed unnaturally in the small space, and she hated the way it seemed to come back louder than she'd made it. But the minutes crawled by without incident. No answering knocks, no whispers. For the first time in weeks, a sense of fragile relief bloomed in her chest. She thought she might have found the key, continuing patient 43's ritual, no matter where she was. But then came the fourth knock. It wasn't hers. Her body went rigid, the air thickening like molasses around her. Slowly she turned her head toward the bathroom door. The sound had come from there. Tap. Again, this time accompanied by a faint scraping, like nails dragging across hollow wood. She barely managed a whisper. "Who's there?" The silence that answered was suffocating. She slid to the edge of the bed, every instinct screaming at her to flee. But when she reached the door, she saw it, faint letters scratched into the cheap paint, invisible in daylight, but catching the moonlight now. "I knocked. You must too." The next morning she returned to the house. There was no logic to the decision, only desperation. She couldn't outrun it. She had tried. As she unlocked the door, a wave of ice-cold air greeted her, carrying with it the faintest scent of smoke. The house was silent, oppressive. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally as she made her way to the bedroom. She placed her hand against the wall and whispered, "I'm here. I'll keep knocking." Her knuckles met plaster. Tap, tap, tap. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sound came, not from within the walls this time, but from under the floorboards. Tap, tap, tap. She stumbled backward as the vibrations grew stronger, the knocks traveling across the room, like something crawling beneath her feet. Her mind raced. Patient 43 had warned them, warned everyone. "If I stop, they'll come." What did they mean? Who or what was he keeping at bay all those years? Her answer came in the form of a low, guttural whisper, rising from the floorboards, curling up her spine until it felt as though cold fingers gripped her neck. "You stopped." The whisper lingered in the air long after it was spoken. "You stopped." It didn't sound angry. Worse, it sounded disappointed, like something ancient and patient had been waiting for her to fail. She staggered back against the dresser, her hands trembling so violently she could barely grip the edge. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out, but her legs wouldn't obey. Then the knocks resumed, louder than ever, pounding now, as if fists were hammering from beneath the floorboards. Tap, tap. Each strike reverberated through the house, rattling picture frames and sending a low, groaning echo up the walls. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming from outside her. It was inside her skull, vibrating through her teeth, her spine, her very thoughts. She screamed. The sound tore out of her throat, raw and ragged, but it was swallowed by the pounding that now seemed to come from every surface. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence that followed wasn't a relief. It was worse, heavier, like the air had thickened into oil. She stood frozen in place, ears ringing, lungs aching as if she'd forgotten how to breathe. Then, faintly, she heard it again. A voice, not a whisper this time, but clearer, sharper, cutting straight into her mind. "Your turn," or "their turn." The message was unmistakable. Patient 43's ritual wasn't a plea for help. It was a responsibility. A curse passed down, hand to hand, through whoever heard the knocks. He had warned them in his files. If he stopped knocking, they would come. And now she was next in line. Desperation clawed at her chest as she grabbed a kitchen knife and pried at the floorboards where the pounding had been strongest. The wood splintered under her hands, sending jagged shards into her palms, but she didn't care. She had to see what was under there. She had to know. Finally, the board gave way with a sickening crack. Beneath it was only dirt, dark and dry, except for a patch in the center where the soil had turned black and wet, as though something had bled into it for decades. Carved into the earth in shaky, frantic letters was a message: "I kept them out. You must too." Then came the first sound, a dragging, shuffling noise beneath the dirt. It wasn't a knock. It was movement. Something was down there, something waiting. She stumbled backward, her knife slipping from bloodied hands. The dragging grew louder, closer, until it sounded as though fingernails were scraping at the underside of the floorboards. A voice rose from the earth, layered and distorted, as though hundreds of mouths spoke in unison. "You stopped. Now we're here." She ran. Out of the house, down the street, barefoot, her lungs burning as icy wind cut her skin. But even as she put distance between herself and the house, she heard it, not from the floorboards, not from the walls, from inside her own skull. Tap, tap, tap. She screamed into the empty night. But it didn't stop. Each knock grew sharper, more insistent, like invisible hands rapping against her temples. Tap, tap. She fell to her knees on the cold asphalt, sobbing, clutching her head in both hands. But then, as suddenly as it began, the knocking ceased. The silence was complete, too complete. She lifted her tear-streaked face, hoping the nightmare had passed. That's when she felt it. A cold, dry hand pressed gently against the back of her neck, and a voice, calm and quiet, almost tender: "Keep knocking." The next morning her car was found parked in front of her house. The driver's seat was empty. The door was wide open, but inside the house, faintly audible to anyone standing perfectly still, there was a sound. Tap, tap, tap. There is a weight to silence that feels almost intelligent, as if it's waiting for something. The house on the old Ridgeview grounds was full of that kind of silence, now dense and oppressive. Neighbors said they didn't hear her leave, yet her car appeared parked neatly in the driveway at dawn. The driver's door hung open, keys dangling in the ignition, an eerie invitation to approach. But no one did. Something about the house kept them away. Later that day, a delivery man approached the front steps, but froze mid-knock. A sound drifted from within. Soft, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. At first, he thought it was the wind rattling a shutter, but it grew louder, closer. His hand dropped, and he backed away slowly, heart pounding. He never delivered the package. Word spread quickly in hushed voices. People began crossing the street, rather than walk past that house. They remembered now the fire, the asylum, the stories of Ridgeview's East Wing, of the patient who knocked to keep things away. They couldn't quite say what things meant, but in this town, no one really wanted to know. For Eleanor, the memories came back like a long-suppressed scream. She was older now, retired, but she remembered Ridgeview. She had been just 20 when she worked the night shifts in the East Wing, long before the fire consumed it. Patient 43 had been her responsibility, though responsibility felt like a cruel understatement. He was always knocking, his fingers swollen and raw from hours of rapping against brick and plaster. The sound had been so constant that staff joked about it in the break room, pretending it didn't bother them. But it did. At night, alone in the halls, Eleanor swore she heard the knocking in her dreams. She told herself it was in her head, but then there were reports, orderlies hearing it in the walls, visitors asking why someone kept hammering unseen. One nurse claimed she'd heard knocks, even when 43 was strapped down and sedated. They laughed it off, but fear settled quietly in their bones. Eleanor quit after a year, unable to bear the restless weight in her chest each night. She left work. She never thought she'd hear that sound again. Until now, at precisely 3:07 a.m., Eleanor awoke to the sound of 3 soft, measured knocks coming from her bedroom wall. Tap, tap, tap. Her eyes flew open in the darkness. The room felt wrong, thicker somehow, like the air itself pressed inward. She told herself it was a dream, a lingering memory, nothing more. But when the knocks came again, louder this time, she felt her heart pound so violently, she thought her ribs might crack. Tap, tap, she whispered into the stillness. No, no, you're not real. But deep down she already knew. She had heard those knocks before, decades ago in a burning asylum, where shadows shifted in corners and voices whispered through cracks in the walls. The sound was unmistakable. Patient 43's ritual had found her. She pressed her hands over her ears and waited. Minutes passed. Silence returned, but it didn't feel like a reprieve. It felt like the silence was breathing, waiting for her to fail. The next morning, Eleanor drove to Ridgeview's ruins, or what was left of them. Her old workplace was long gone, replaced by neat suburban homes. She parked outside the house where the missing woman had last been seen, staring at its dark windows. The front door seemed almost expectant, like it recognized her. She stepped out of the car, her heart racing. As she approached, she could swear she saw movement behind the curtains, a flicker of shadow. She pressed her palm to the door and whispered, "I remember." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then came the sound, faint but deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. She felt it vibrate against her skin, deep enough to rattle her bones. She staggered back, horror rising in her chest. It was still here. Whatever patient 43 had feared hadn't died with him. It had survived, hiding in the spaces between walls and floors, waiting for someone new to take up the ritual. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. At 3:06 a.m., she sat on the edge of her bed, trembling as she raised her knuckles to the wooden nightstand. She whispered, "I'll do it." Her hand trembled as she knocked 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The sound felt pitiful in the dark, but it was all she could manage. She waited, holding her breath. No answering knocks came, just silence. Her heart hammered in her chest. For a moment she dared to believe it had worked, that perhaps she'd satisfied the thing lurking unseen. But then she remembered the look in patient 43's eyes as he'd whispered, "They don't like it when you stop." She sat awake until dawn, too terrified to close her eyes, certain she could feel unseen eyes watching her from the corners of the room. Days passed. Each night, Eleanor continued the ritual. Tap, tap, tap. The sound became mechanical, her fingers bruised and aching from repetition. But she didn't dare stop. She had read enough of patient 43's file to understand. Staff had ignored his knocking for 3 nights before the east wing burned. His notes, scribbled in margins and scratched into the walls of his cell, told a single story. They need the sound. Without it, they slip through. Eleanor didn't know who they were, and she didn't want to. All she knew was that every time she hesitated, she felt the air around her shift, subtle at first, then heavier, darker, thicker, as though unseen hands were reaching for her, stretching out from the shadows. But Eleanor was old, her body frail. After 7 nights, Her hands could no longer form a proper fist. Her knuckles were swollen, her skin cracked and bleeding. She sat weeping on the floor, whispering apologies to patient 43. "I can't," she said. "I'm too tired." She didn't realize the sound had stopped until it was too late. For the first time in a week, there were no answering knocks from her walls, just silence. A silence so complete, it seemed to hum. She closed her eyes, praying it wasn't too late. Then a voice came from the dark. "You stopped." There was a stillness in the room that felt wrong, too heavy for the small apartment. Eleanor's breath came shallow, ragged, her body refusing to move. The words echoed in her head, low and venomous, "You stopped." The air grew colder, sharp enough to sting her lungs. Something unseen shifted in the corner of her vision. But when she looked directly, there was nothing, only the shadows thickening like spilled ink. She tried to speak, to apologize, but her throat closed tight, as though unseen fingers gripped it from the inside. Then came a sound, different from the soft knocks she'd come to dread. This was a dragging, scraping noise from beneath the floorboards, like nails clawing through wood. Eleanor pressed her hands to her ears, rocking in place, but she could still hear it. Not through her ears, through her bones. The clock ticked past 3:07 a.m. She had failed. In that moment, Eleanor understood why patient 43's notes had been so frantic, why his warnings had been scratched into every surface of his cell. The ritual wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a protection. It was a duty, a contract of survival. And now it was broken. She felt movement under her feet, faint tremors like something vast and heavy shifting deep underground. Her eyes darted to the far wall. She swore she saw a handprint bloom across the paint, long fingers dragging slowly downward. A voice rose from everywhere and nowhere at once, layered and wrong, as though 100 whispers spoke in unison. "Our turn." The next morning, Eleanor was found wandering the streets barefoot, muttering to herself. Her neighbor, Mr. Cole, described her as hollow-eyed and drenched in sweat despite the cold. When he tried to guide her back inside, she recoiled violently and screamed, "Don't let them in! Don't let them in!" Later she was admitted to the same psychiatric ward that had replaced Ridgeview decades earlier, but the staff there didn't know her history. They didn't know the sound she feared would soon visit them too. That night, an orderly making his rounds paused outside Eleanor's room. From inside, faint but steady, came 3 soft knocks. Tap, tap, tap. Across town, the house on Ridgeview's former grounds grew restless. The neighbors began to notice subtle changes, birds refusing to perch on its roof, cats hissing as they passed, children crying inconsolably when they got too close. At night, lights flickered behind drawn curtains, though no one lived there anymore. And always, faint in the stillness, the sound of someone knocking, measured, deliberate, like a metronome keeping time. Some swore they even heard whispers carried on the wind. "Your turn." The bravest among them dared to press their ear to the door. Most fled in terror, but a few didn't leave. By the end of that week, reports of knocking spread to other parts of town. A teacher heard it in the walls of her classroom. A mechanic heard it beneath the floor of his garage. A young mother awoke at 3:07 a.m. to find her toddler tapping rhythmically against the crib bars, eyes wide and unblinking. When she asked what he was doing, he whispered, "They said I have to." That same night, her husband heard knocks in the pipes while showering. 3 slow, deliberate taps that seemed to echo from every corner of the house. The town grew restless, People began sharing stories online, first anonymously, then in full threads dedicated to the strange occurrences. A man posted a recording from his baby monitor, 3 clear knocks at exactly 3:07 a.m., followed by a faint voice saying, "Keep knocking." The thread exploded overnight. Hundreds of comments flooded in. Most dismissed it as a hoax, but others shared their own experiences: knocks in empty apartments, scratches in the walls, whispers on the edge of sleep. A few even claimed to see things in the shadows, long fingers reaching, shapes moving just out of sight. The phenomenon gained a name in online forums, the knocker's curse. Some theorized it was an urban legend, fueled by mass hysteria. Others insisted it was tied to the land, to Ridgeview's dark history. A few dug into old asylum records and uncovered references to patient 43's nightly ritual. His warnings sent chills through even the most skeptical readers. If I stop, they come. If you hear them, it's already too late. Screenshots of his file spread like wildfire. But most people didn't take it seriously, not until the first disappearance. The town was unraveling, though most people didn't yet realize it. What began as faint knocks in a few scattered homes was now a chorus of whispers carried on the night air. Residents reported hearing soft tapping in their walls, pipes and ceilings, always at 3:07 a.m. At first, they blamed old plumbing or expanding wood in the cold, but when the knocking started moving, following them from room to room, floor to floor, denial became harder to cling to. A young couple described how they fled their home after hearing their child's voice repeating, your turn," from behind a locked closet door. When the husband finally wrenched it open, there was no one inside, just 3 faint handprints pressed into the plaster. At the heart of it all was the Ridgeview house. Neighbors reported lights flickering in its windows, though the power had been cut months ago. Some swore they saw figures in the yard at night, thin, twitching silhouettes that dissolved when approached. And then there were the new keepers. No one chose them, the house did. It began with subtle whispers in their dreams, leading to compulsions they couldn't explain. A woman named Claire found herself returning to the house nightly, drawn as if on a leash. She didn't remember entering, but neighbors saw her silhouette pacing back and forth through the windows, her hand endlessly rapping against the walls. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Tap, 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 tap. The house had a way of knowing who to call. It didn't care if they resisted. Resistance only made the sound louder, more insistent. When Claire stopped knocking on the 4th night, she vanished. Her car was later found abandoned 2 streets over. Driver's door open, keys in the ignition, just like the woman before her. By now, even skeptics began locking their doors at night and sleeping with lights on. But it didn't help. The knocking didn't need permission to enter. Online forums documenting the events became flooded with frantic posts. A man described being awoken by knocks inside his bedroom closet, even though it was filled with boxes too heavy to move. When he refused to investigate, a whisper slid through the keyhole. "They'll come if you don't." Another woman posted that she had begun knocking back in desperation, but it wasn't enough. She recorded the sound, 3 hollow taps echoing in the dead of night, and uploaded it to the thread. Hours later, her account went silent. Other users begged her for updates, but none came. Then someone discovered her address. When they drove past her home, they saw faint lights flickering in the windows, and if they rolled their windows down, they swore they could hear it. Tap, tap, tap. A theory emerged among the terrified online community. The ritual was like a chain, passed from person to person. Patient 43 had kept it alive as long as he could. but his death had caused it to spread unchecked. Now the burden had no single keeper. It jumped hosts when one failed. Some believed it would keep doing so until it found someone strong enough to take it on forever. Others were less hopeful, suggesting the curse was growing stronger with each lapse. Every time someone stops knocking, one user wrote, "It lets more of them in," but no one could say what they were, and few wanted to find out. The phenomenon wasn't confined to homes anymore. A nurse at the psychiatric ward, where Eleanor now sat catatonic, reported faint knocking from the supply closet in the east wing. At first she thought it was another patient, but when she opened the door, she found the room empty, save for faint scratches gouged into the floorboards. They read, "Keep knocking." That same night, an orderly was found in the break room staring blankly at the wall, his fingers bruised and bleeding from hours of tapping. He couldn't explain why he'd started, only that he felt something waiting. His knuckles were raw, his eyes never left the wall. By week's end, whispers of the knocker's curse had spread to local news. Reporters approached the Ridgeview house, though none stayed long. One segment aired a clip of faint knocking heard during the recording, sending chills through viewers. Some dismissed it as an audio glitch. Others weren't so sure. Calls flooded in from nearby towns, people claiming to hear similar sounds. One man even reported knocking on the windows of his parked car while driving past Ridgeview's ruins. The knocking had followed him home, and at 3:07 a.m. across countless darkened bedrooms, a single whisper now echoed like a shared nightmare. "Your turn." It began with a single house, but now it had no borders. The knocking had spread like a sickness, unseen but deeply felt, infecting block after block, until entire neighborhoods pulsed with its rhythm. At first, only a few could hear it, those sensitive to the quiet horrors that slip between walls and floorboards. But as the days passed, the sound grew bolder. People heard it in grocery stores, offices, even on public transit. A subway full of commuters froze in terror when 3 loud, deliberate knocks echoed from the metal walls of their car, though no one stood near enough to make them. One man tried laughing it off. "It's just pipes," he said. But when he got home, his daughter greeted him by tapping 3 times on the living room wall, her small fist bruised purple. "I had to, Daddy," she whispered. "They told me." The news still hadn't caught up. Outside Ridgeview, most people believed it was an urban legend, a hoax born from online hysteria. But within the town, reality was crumbling. Entire streets stood abandoned, cars left running, meals half-eaten on tables. Those who remained stayed awake at night, clutching baseball bats and knives, as if steel could fend off what was coming. But there was no use. The knocking didn't come from outside. It came from within their homes, their walls, their minds. And when they refused to answer, the whispers started, first faint, then louder. "You stopped. You stopped." In an apartment complex 20 miles from Ridgeview, a tenant recorded faint knocks coming from the pipes in his bathroom. He posted the video online, laughing nervously as he rapped 3 times on the tiled wall in return. The video went viral overnight, but his next upload, filmed hours later, was different. The man sat on his bathroom floor, pale and shaking. His knuckles were raw, blood smearing the tiles. "I tried to stop," he said. "They're in the walls now." A soft dragging sound rose in the background, followed by a whisper so low it seemed to vibrate the camera microphone. "Our turn." The feed cut to black. By the end of the week, entire apartment blocks had fallen silent. Emergency services entered one building to find every door ajar, every unit empty, except for faint, frantic knock marks on walls and floors. Some were written in blood. In one apartment, a single phrase had been carved into the plaster again and again. Investigators claimed the disappearances were staged or exaggerated, but their voices betrayed them, thin, brittle, too high with suppressed fear. Even they had started hearing it at night. And in Ridgeview itself, the house stood patient and hungry, its windows like watchful eyes. It had chosen dozens of keepers by now. None lasted. Their bodies were never found, but their voices lingered in faint echoes through its halls. Keep knocking. Please, keep knocking. Sometimes neighbors thought they heard children's laughter from within. Sometimes screams. Always at 3:07 a.m. came the sound. Tap, tap, tap. As the phenomenon spread, theories multiplied. Some claimed the house was a parasite, feeding on silence and fear, growing stronger with every lapse in the ritual. Others believed it was a gateway, a mouth opening wider each night. A few whispered of the voices. Patient 43 had described in his final days how they begged him to stop knocking, how sweetly they promised relief, if only he let them in. No one knew what happened when he did, but survivors said they caught glimpses, long thin hands slipping through cracks in the floor, pale faces grinning from mirrors. One man attempted to organize an online movement, keep the sound alive. He encouraged people to knock 3 times nightly in unison, a global ritual to keep whatever it was at bay. For a time it seemed to work. The reports slowed, the knocking grew fainter. Hope returned, fragile but present, until the night his live stream ended abruptly, mid-sentence, with the sound of 3 loud, hollow knocks. His chair creaked, the camera tilted violently. Then nothing. The next morning, thousands of people reported hearing a whisper in their homes at 3:07 a.m. Your turn. The sound spread like a virus carried on the wind. In cities miles from Ridgeview, office workers sat frozen at their desks as faint knocking echoed through skyscraper walls. Maintenance teams inspected pipes, vents, electrical systems, always finding nothing. In subway tunnels, commuters flinched when the steel beams groaned 3 times in a slow, deliberate rhythm. At first, no one connected it to Ridgeview. Urban legends don't belong in places with millions of people, concrete, and noise. But at night, even the busiest cities have their silences, and in those silences, the knocking found space to grow. A nurse at a major hospital described how her entire ward awoke at 3:07 a.m. to a chorus of soft taps. Patients whispered in their sleep, some knocking weakly against their bed rails. One old man clawed at his IV stand and rasped, "They're here for us." A janitor quit on the spot after hearing 3 knocks from the morgue freezer, each louder than the last. The sound followed him home. His family never saw him again. In a high-rise apartment, a young woman documented her experience in a viral thread. The posts began innocently enough. Weird sounds in the walls, probably rats. A day later, the knocks are getting louder, 3 a.m. every night. By the 4th night, her tone changed. "I knocked back. I shouldn't have." Now they're in the vents. Her final post was only 5 words, time-stamped at 3:07 a.m. Your turn. Keep knocking. Please. Her account went dark. The phenomenon no longer respected boundaries. It didn't matter if you lived in a penthouse or a farmhouse, in a mansion or a slum. The sound came all the same. 3 measured taps, sometimes soft, almost gentle, other times so loud it cracked drywall. Some residents fled their homes, others tried to drown it out with music, prayer, or shouting. None of it worked. The knocking didn't stop. It waited, patient, hungry, and when it wasn't answered, the whispers began. Researchers scrambled to explain it. Acoustics, mass hysteria, electromagnetic fields. But behind closed doors, even scientists admitted the truth. They heard it too. A viral leak of one research lab's recording showed 3 heavy knocks, followed by a voice whispering in static, "Don't stop. Don't you dare stop." The clip was taken down within hours, but copies spread across the web like wildfire. Thousands who listened claimed they began hearing faint tapping in their homes within days. Entire blocks went dark in one city after reports of coordinated knocking rising from sewer grates. Power grids failed without explanation. Residents fled as shadows gathered under streetlights, long-fingered and twitching. Security cameras caught glimpses, slender forms moving between buildings too fast and too tall to be human. Official reports called them artifacts of video compression, but survivors knew better. The knocking was no longer just a sound. It had shape now, and it was learning how to move. At the center of it all, Ridgeview's house waited. Though hundreds of miles from the chaos, it remained the epicenter, the place where it all began. Lights flickered in its windows despite no power. Figures could sometimes be seen at night, pacing, knocking, whispering. Some claimed they saw faces at the glass, gaunt, hollow-eyed, lips forming silent words. Your turn. It had chosen new keepers countless times, but none endured. Now it no longer waited for volunteers. It reached for them wherever they were. And at 3:07 a.m. in every time zone, a single sound echoed across continents, as though the earth itself had become hollow. Tap, tap. By now, the world was learning a terrible truth. Silence wasn't safety anymore. It was an invitation. Those who stayed quiet long enough would hear it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. And if they didn't answer, something came to fill the void. In rural areas, entire families vanished, their homes left unlocked, meals still warm on the table. In cities, people took to pounding on walls, floors and furniture in a desperate attempt to keep the ritual alive. But fatigue claimed many. Sleep deprived and trembling, they slumped against cold surfaces, their knuckles raw, and whispered to no one, "I can't anymore." That was always when the whispers began. In one coastal town, survivors barricaded themselves in an abandoned church, taking shifts to maintain the sound. They used hammers, drumsticks, their own fists, anything to keep knocking. For days it worked. The sounds outside stopped, but when one man collapsed from exhaustion mid-shift, the silence lasted just long enough. The doors began rattling violently as voices seeped through the cracks. "You stopped. You let us in." No one in the church survived the night. The internet, once a source of comfort and connection, became a living archive of terror. Live streams showed panicked knocking in kitchens and bedrooms, broadcasts ending abruptly with faint whispers or deafening crashes. Viral clips captured glimpses of inhuman shapes in reflections and security footage. Lank, twitching forms slipping out of view as lights flickered. Forums filled with desperate messages. "How long do I have to knock? Is there a way out?" Some begged for answers. Others warned that the sound was no longer enough. In government offices worldwide, reports labeled unconfirmed anomalies piled up. Emergency hotlines were overwhelmed with calls describing knocking sounds, shadowy figures, and sudden disappearances. One leaked memo revealed a chilling possibility. The phenomenon wasn't random, it was coordinated, intelligent. If these entities are acting as a collective, the memo read, their goal appears to be total saturation, forcing every human alive into the ritual, then testing who fails. A handwritten note at the bottom added a single line, what happens when everyone fails? As the days passed, a new horror emerged. The knocking was evolving. It no longer waited for silence. People reported hearing it even while shouting, crying, praying. Some described feeling vibrations in their bones, as if the sound had moved inside them. Others claimed the knocks now came in groups of 4 or 5, erratic and impatient. One terrified survivor uploaded a voice recording before disappearing. The faint, distorted whisper said, keep knocking, but faster this time. Ridgeview's house, long thought to be the epicenter, had gone quiet. No lights, no movement, no sound. Satellite images showed the property shrouded in an unexplainable black haze, but some claimed to hear faint knocking if they stood at its perimeter, so faint it felt like a memory rather than a sound. One theory spread online. The house no longer needed to call out. It had grown. Its influence was everywhere now. The world had become its walls. Humanity had become its keepers. Those still clinging to hope formed global networks, urging one another to maintain the ritual. They set alarms, created apps to synchronize knocking, even built machines to pound out the rhythm in abandoned zones. But cracks were forming. Machines failed. People slept. And when they did, dreams came, dreams of hollow-eyed figures pressing their faces to the glass, tapping with swollen fingers, whispering, your turn. One woman posted that she saw patient 43 in her dream, his hands bruised and bleeding, his mouth forming silent words. I tried, you have to. She never finished the thread. And at 3:07 a.m. in every country across oceans and continents, a new sound joined the knocking, a deep, resonant groan, as though the earth itself was opening. Then came the whisper, louder than ever before, you all stopped. At 3:07 a.m., the world held its breath, and the knocking stopped. For the first time in weeks, there was no sound in the walls, no trembling pipes or rattling doors. At first, people thought they were free. Some wept in relief, believing the nightmare had passed, but relief soon curdled into dread. Survivors described the silence as alive, heavier than air, pressing into their ears like invisible hands. Animals grew restless. Dogs howled, cats bolted, birds flew in frantic circles before crashing into windows. And then the groaning began. A low, resonant sound rolled across the earth like the cracking of ancient timbers. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The first to vanish were those who had knocked the longest. In one city, neighbors watched in horror as an entire apartment block went dark floor by floor, screams cutting short mid-sentence. Emergency crews arrived to find every door ajar, rooms empty save for walls covered in frantic gouges and bruised handprints. In the center of one apartment, scrawled in blood, were the words, "We knocked as long as we could." Across the street, a lone survivor huddled under a table, whispering to herself. Her voice was hoarse from hours of rhythmic tapping on the floor. When rescuers found her, she clung to their sleeves and cried, "Don't stop knocking, please, don't stop." She was gone the next night. Governments scrambled to respond, as entire neighborhoods fell silent. Power grids failed. Cell towers went offline. In a desperate act, officials launched a global rhythm initiative, broadcasting synchronized knocks across radio and television networks. For a brief moment, the sound filled the world again, millions of speakers pounding out 3 slow taps in unison. Hope flared. But then, across every broadcast, a new sound seeped in. A voice, layered and inhuman, whispered, "Too late." The feeds dissolved into static. When they returned, the knocking was gone. In hospitals, patients began screaming at 3:07 a.m., clutching their ears as if the silence itself was clawing through their skulls. Security footage captured horrifying images, long skeletal hands pressing against glass from the inside of locked rooms, faces staring from shadows where no one stood. In one children's ward, nurses heard a soft chorus of voices humming in unison. We waited. Now we're here. The entire floor was found empty by morning. Across oceans and continents, the phenomenon became impossible to contain. Ships drifting at sea fell silent. Their crews vanished without distress calls. Planes disappeared from radar. Mid-flight, black boxes later recovered, with nothing but 3 slow knocks recorded in the final seconds. Cities became husks, streets littered with abandoned cars, lights flickering in empty windows. Those who remained clung to rituals, banging pots, hammering nails, stomping their feet in frantic patterns, but fatigue always won. One by one, their knocking faltered. One by one, their voices joined the chorus, whispering from walls and vents, "Your turn. You stopped. You let us in." At Ridgeview's house, the birthplace of the horror, something shifted. The haze around it thickened into a black shroud, pulsing as if alive. Satellite imagery showed the darkness spreading outward in jagged tendrils, creeping over roads and swallowing surrounding homes. Those who dared approach vanished. Drone footage captured only glimpses, skeletal figures pressed to windows, twitching fingers pounding against glass, faces grinning as the camera feed dissolved into static. A single message flickered across the screen before the drone failed. "The walls are gone, only doors remain." And then the whispers grew louder, no longer confined to walls or shadows. They came from the earth, the sky, the air itself. "Your turn, your turn." People tried screaming to drown them out, but the voices pressed closer. Some felt icy hands wrap around their throats in the darkness. Others saw long, thin shapes slipping through mirrors, televisions, phone screens. One man posted a frantic voice memo before disappearing. "They're everywhere now. We were the doors all along." By the end of the week, the world had grown almost silent. No birds sang, no children cried. The only sound left was faint, patient knocking, echoing through empty cities, tapping from within walls that no longer held anyone. At 3:07 a.m., across the entire earth, the whisper came louder than ever before. "You all stopped, and now we begin." Silence devoured the world in slow, careful bites. Once, it was a comfort, something people sought in the spaces between their frantic lives. Now it had weight, a suffocating pressure that made lungs ache and ears ring. Survivors of the first waves of disappearances had learned to fear quiet moments most of all. In that unnatural stillness, when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, they would hear it. 3 soft, deliberate knocks, always from different places. Walls, floors, ceilings, the cold glass of a bathroom mirror. It didn't matter where it came from. What mattered was answering. For those too slow to respond, there was only the whisper that followed, as inevitable as death. "Your turn." Around the globe, people had once rallied in defiance, pounding walls, stomping floors, clanging pots in kitchens. But that was weeks ago. Fatigue was a disease all its own, and more often now their hands fell still. That's when the world learned there were worse things than silence. In the hushed aftermath, some clung to scraps of the past, desperately recalling Ridgeview's stories, as if understanding patient 43 might offer a way back. They spoke his name like a prayer, though most never knew it. He had been the first door, his broken knuckles a sacrifice to keep the voices out. He knocked so long his skin split and bones shattered, and yet the logs recovered from Ridgeview whispered how, in the end, even he faltered. 3 days of silence, Eleanor had written. 3 days without knocking. Now the walls move. What had entered in those days? What had watched through the cracks he left behind? No one could say. The archives told only fragments. Shadows spilling from beneath his bed, whispers coaxing him to rest. His final entry, found carved into the cell's wall with bloodied fingers, was not a warning but an apology. I tried. Far from Ridgeview, cities had become mausoleums. The streets of New York echoed faintly with abandoned alarms and car horns blaring at nothing. London's underground was a graveyard of stalled trains, lights flickering in unoccupied cars. In Tokyo, digital billboards flickered static, where once they flashed neon joy. Every time zone, every culture, every language heard the same dread at 3:07 a.m. 3 slow knocks. Humanity's attempts to fight back grew stranger as desperation deepened. Entire apartment blocks synchronized their knocks to phone alarms. Radio stations broadcast rhythms day and night. Even satellites pulsed mechanical taps through frequencies no one had used before. But the hunger was too great, the spread too vast. Each failed attempt only seemed to make the sound grow louder. And with each lapse, more people vanished. Those left behind whispered a horrifying belief. It wasn't just coming through walls anymore. It was in the earth, in the air, in their blood. There were those who refused to knock, not from defiance, but from something darker. An irresistible call in their minds, urging them to open doors, not guard them. These people were different. Their eyes grew dark, their voices hollow. Some walked naked into the streets at night, whispering fragments of patient 43's ramblings, their not voices, their hands. Cold hands pulling at the cracks. Others began knocking in irregular patterns, 4 taps, 5, 7, breaking the ritual intentionally. Survivors called them the Hollowed. Watching them was like seeing puppets dancing on unseen strings, their movements jerky, inhuman. When one finally stopped, there was no scream, no struggle, only the sound of nails dragging across dry wall, followed by silence so thick it felt solid. At Ridgeview, the house had disappeared beneath a swelling black mass, an ever-expanding stain that swallowed surrounding homes, roads, even forests. Satellite images no longer showed its shape. Some believed it was gone completely, but those who tuned old radios to static claimed they could hear faint knocking beneath the noise. Others reported whispers, not of the voices, but of patient 43 himself. His sobs came through in fits and starts, his words garbled but desperate. Don't let them through. Don't stop knocking. For a moment hope flickered. If his voice remained, perhaps some part of him was still fighting. Perhaps the ritual could be reclaimed. But that fragile hope shattered the night. Every radio, every speaker in the world came alive at once. Survivors froze as an inhuman voice whispered across all frequencies, layered and echoing like millions of mouths speaking at once. The first door opened. You are next. Then came the knock. 3 deafening crashes, loud enough to rattle skyscrapers, loud enough to crack windows. Across every country, People dropped to their knees as their ears bled, clutching their skulls. And in that moment, a vision swept through humanity like a fever dream. An endless black expanse, writhing with pale hands and smiling faces, reaching outward from the darkness. It was not just a house. It was not even a place. It was alive, and it was hungry. Patient 43's journal, rediscovered in an abandoned Ridgeview archive, spoke of this moment in cryptic detail. The house grows each time a door fails. I was the first. I failed. Now they know how to open us. His words suggested a terrible truth, that every human had become a door waiting to be breached. And when breached, the sound no longer came from outside. It came from within. Survivors began reporting the knock in their own chests, 3 dull thuds behind their ribs. Some clawed at their skin, begging others to listen. It's in me. It's knocking from the inside. By the end of that week, few remained. Those who still knocked were shadows of their former selves, bodies breaking under the strain of unending repetition, hands bruised, bones cracked, fingernails torn away. But they kept going, driven not by hope, but by sheer terror. For they had seen what patient 43 saw in his final moments, the thing that waits when the knocking stops. And now they understood. Humanity had never been the keepers. They were the walls. There was no morning anymore, only the dull grey of a world that had forgotten how to rise. Survivors, if they could still be called that, no longer marked time in days or hours, but in knocks. Each night brought the ritual, more frantic and painful than the last. They drummed their fists against walls until bones cracked, until knuckles split and blood smeared across plaster like desperate graffiti. Yet it was never enough. At 3:07 a.m., the voices still came, closer now, clearer. Once they had been faint murmurs, seductive in their quiet promises. Now they shouted, a cacophony of demands pounding in every skull. Faster, harder. Stop sleeping, stop breathing, just knock. It was no longer a ritual of survival. It was a sentence, and the world was serving it with trembling hands. In the wreckage of cities, new myths bloomed like weeds. People spoke of the hollow choir, an unseen gathering of those who had failed. At night, their voices rose from sewer grates, storm drains, and the spaces between cracked foundations, 1,000 whispers blending into a single terrible harmony. Some claimed the choir could be heard beneath one's bed, humming just softly enough to be mistaken for the wind. The melody was always the same, 3 rising tones, as if mimicking the knock. One survivor tried recording it, posting the audio online before vanishing. Those who listened reported hearing faint taps on their walls within hours. A few insisted the sound had started in their own throats, their voices no longer their own. Patient 43 had written of this phase decades earlier. In tattered pages found at Ridgeview, he described how the voices transformed over time, growing impatient, aggressive. They're learning us, he scrawled in cramped, shaking letters. They know our fears. They sound like my mother, my wife, my own voice. I don't know which is real anymore. His desperation bled through every word. If I stop knocking, they'll wear my skin. They'll use my face. No one will know. One researcher's notes added a chilling theory. Perhaps the voices weren't external at all. Perhaps they were the house, speaking through infected minds, turning doors into open hallways. Communities tried to rebuild the ritual. Survivors banded together in abandoned factories and subway tunnels, constructing crude machines to keep the rhythm alive. Giant pistons that slammed against steel walls, hammers powered by salvage generators. For a time, it worked. The knocks echoed through concrete and iron, and the voices quieted, but machines failed, power drained, and when the noise faltered, the things came. One by one, the machines stopped. One by one, the survivors screamed. What followed was always the same. Silence broken only by the slow, deliberate knock from within the walls. Those still able to speak shared visions of Ridgeview's house. Though long consumed by the black haze, it appeared in their dreams with perfect clarity. Each dream began the same way. They would stand at the foot of the stairs, staring at the door with its peeling white paint and faint bloodstains where knuckles had once pounded for mercy. From behind the door came a voice, not the layered inhumanity of the whispers, but a single human voice. Patient 43 says, "Don't open it. Whatever you do, don't open it." But the dream always ended with a hand, thin, pale, clawed, resting on the knob. More journals surfaced, fragments from Ridgeview staff, who had monitored patient 43 in his final days. One nurse described how he began knocking, not only on his walls, but on his own chest, his own skull. He said the voices had found a way inside. He said he could feel them knocking back from within him. Her entry ended with a single question, underlined twice. Was he the first door or the first wall? At 3:07 a.m., the world trembled. A new sound joined the ritual. Not the knock, but something deeper. A groan that came from the earth itself, like a colossal structure shifting under unimaginable weight. Survivors huddled in the dark as their homes creaked and warped. Cracks spread across ceilings, floors buckled. It was as if the world's foundations were being pried apart from below. And then the whisper came again, closer than ever. Your walls are weak. Your doors are open. They called it the final vigil. Across the few remaining heavens, subway tunnels, abandoned oil rigs, mountaintop monasteries, the last survivors synchronized their knocks. Someone had cobbled together a satellite link, broadcasting a single, unified rhythm, 3 deliberate taps, spaced 4 seconds apart. Around the globe, bloody hands mimicked the sound. Fists pounded, cracked wood, metal pipes, even bare concrete. Every surface became a drum in humanity's frantic chorus. It wasn't just survival now, it was defiance. They knocked for their families, their vanished neighbors, their own fraying minds. They knocked because the alternative was unthinkable. Somewhere deep down, they still believed that patient 43 had held them safe once, and that perhaps they could do the same. For a moment, it seemed to work. The whispers dulled, withdrawing to faint murmurs at the edge of hearing. Shadows no longer pressed so close to candlelight. Survivors dared to breathe again. Some began to hope. But the house had grown wise. It no longer needed their silence to enter. In one bunker, a man paused mid-knock to catch his breath, and found his reflection smiling back at him from a darkened window. He screamed as thin, grey hands burst through the glass, wrapping around his neck. His final words echoed across the radio before static claimed him. It's already inside. Across the world, survivors felt it too. Knocks began coming from within. Walls they'd checked countless times, from floors beneath their feet, from the flesh of their own chests. One woman clawed at her ribs, sobbing, "I can feel its fingers tapping my bones." The hollow choir sang louder now. Cities lay silent, but for their distant voices, a horrible melody threading through collapsed buildings and empty streets. The song carried words no living language could translate, but its meaning sank deep into every mind. The walls are thin, the doors are weak. You are open, Even those who still knocked could feel the rhythm slipping. Their hands moved slower. Muscles gave way to spasms. One by one they faltered, not from choice, but from something heavier, a pressure in their skulls urging them to stop. Some survivors spoke of visions in their final hours, endless black corridors lined with doors, all slightly ajar. Behind each, pale hands beckoned them forward. The urge to open grew overwhelming. Few resisted. Patient 43 had written of this moment. His journal spoke of a threshold where the knocking became futile, a point of no return. When they can knock from both sides of the wall, it's over, he scrawled. It was never about keeping them out. It was about keeping us in. His last entry contained a single damning revelation. I wasn't their prisoner. I was their warden. With his death, the first true door had been flung wide. Humanity was never meant to take his place. As the final vigil collapsed, Ridgeview's house appeared in dreams worldwide. But it was no longer confined to its original form. It sprawled impossibly, its walls stretching across continents, its windows blinking like eyes in the darkness. Every survivor saw the same vision. They stood in its vast foyer as countless doors swung inward. From the shadows emerged the figures, tall, gaunt, eyeless, their hands bruised from centuries of knocking. Their voices overlapped in perfect harmony. We waited, you stopped. Now you are the walls. At 3:07 a.m., the earth itself trembled as a sound unlike any before resonated across oceans and mountains. It was not a knock but a colossal slamming, like an ancient door closing forever. Survivors dropped to their knees, clutching their heads as the voices poured into their minds in a deafening chorus. And then, for the first time in history, there was no knocking, no sound at all. The world had been consumed. In the final fragments of Ridgeview's archives, one note from an unnamed doctor remained. It was written in a careful, almost reverent hand. Patient 43 was never keeping the house out. He was holding it together. Now there are no walls, no doors, only open halls where the voices roam. The house was awake, and it was endless. There was no threshold, no warning. One moment, the survivors clung to their fractured havens, caves, bunkers, flickering, candlelit rooms. The next, they stood in a vast corridor lined with countless doors, each one slightly ajar. The air was thick and warm, like breath from an unseen mouth. Every surface pulsed faintly beneath their fingertips, as though the walls themselves were alive. At first, they tried to retrace their steps, pounding on the doors in a desperate search for escape. But each door opened only to reveal more of the same. Long, featureless halls stretching into shadow, the faint sound of something knocking from far away. They soon understood the truth. This was the house, not the Ridgeview property, but the house as it truly was. Here, there were no boundaries, no foundations, only endless space folded in on itself like a maze built from memory and bone. Some survivors whispered of seeing familiar places within the hallways, a childhood bedroom, an old kitchen table, the waiting room of Ridgeview's asylum. But the familiar always gave way to the impossible. Stairs climbing into black voids, windows revealing nothing but static, ceilings that stretched into infinite heights. And everywhere came the sound of faint knocking, as though the house itself were laughing softly in the dark. They knocked, too, out of instinct. Fists bloodied against doors and walls, they tried to replicate the ritual, but the sound was swallowed almost immediately, devoured by the house's immense oppressive silence. The survivors felt it closing in, not through physical walls but in their minds. Thoughts became fragmented. Memories slipped like water through fingers. One man forgot his own name within minutes. A woman began screaming for her children, though no one could remember if she'd ever had any. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a predator, hollowing them out with every step they took deeper into its halls. Then came the voices, not the faint whispers they'd heard in the world outside, but full-throated and deafening. They spoke in dozens of languages, layered in overlapping tones that scraped the inside of skulls. Why do you knock? You're already here. You've always been here. Survivors clutched their heads, their own hands muffling screams as blood trickled from noses and ears. One by one, they fell to their knees, consumed by visions of thin figures crowding the hallways. These entities had no eyes, no mouths, only long, swollen fingers tapping endlessly against the walls. Amidst the madness, one word began repeating in their thoughts, a voice not quite their own, 43. It came like a heartbeat, slow but insistent. Some understood. Patient 43's memory lingered here, not as a ghost, but as a scar burned into the house's fabric. He had lived and died within these halls long before they existed in the physical world. His knocking had been more than a ritual. It had been the last act of a man trying to hold this place together. The survivors realized their only chance was to find him, or what remained of him, before the house finished devouring their minds. But searching was nearly impossible. Corridors shifted underfoot, twisting like intestines. Doors appeared and disappeared. Some opened to reveal only black voids, pulling at them with unseen force. Others revealed reflections, not of the survivors themselves, but of patient 43. His knuckles raw, his eyes hollow. In some visions, he was still knocking, fists pounding in a slow, steady rhythm. In others, he stood perfectly still, his body twisted and broken, as if the house had finally claimed him. Those who lingered too long in these rooms began to change. Their hands twitched involuntarily, fingers tapping against their thighs or walls. Their voices took on an unfamiliar cadence, matching the layered whispers. One survivor stared into a cracked mirror and watched his own mouth move without his control, whispering, "I'm home." Moments later, his body folded in on itself, vanishing into the floor with a sound like a door slamming shut. And through it all, the house whispered in a voice that grew more intimate with each passing hour. "You knock because you're afraid, but fear is the first door, and it is open." The corridors narrowed as they pressed onward, the air thickening like congealed blood. Walls pulsed faintly beneath their hands, warm and pliant, as though the house itself had grown impatient with their presence. The survivors moved in stumbling silence, their breaths shallow, eyes darting to shadows that stretched impossibly long across the warped floors. Every few steps, a door would slam shut behind them, not with the echo of wood against wood, but with a wet, meaty thud that turned their stomachs. The house was alive, and it did not want them to leave. Worse, it seemed to know them now intimately. Each creak of the floorboards carried a familiar cadence, the sound of their own footsteps, perfectly mirrored, though none dared to glance over their shoulders to see what followed. They came upon a hallway unlike the others, narrower, its ceiling sloping low enough that they had to stoop. Along its length were doors, hundreds of them, each painted with numbers scrawled in black. Some had deep gouges where fingernails had clawed at the wood. Others bore faint handprints, smeared dark with whatever had once served as blood. At first, the survivors moved past them quickly, unwilling to stop. But one number froze them in place, 43. The door stood slightly ajar, darkness seeping from the gap like ink bleeding through paper. From within came a soft, steady sound. 3 deliberate knocks, slow and unhurried. They hesitated, Some whispered that opening it would doom them. Others argued that it was their only chance to understand. In the end, it didn't matter. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a small room lit by a single swinging bulb. The air smelled of iron and rot. Against the far wall sat a figure, thin, trembling, its head bowed. It was Patient 43, or what remained of him. His hands were raised, knuckles bloodied, pounding in that same steady rhythm. But as the survivors stepped closer, they saw the truth. His skin was pale and translucent, stretched too tightly over long alien bones. His face was hidden, but faint whispers leaked from the cracks in his skull, voices overlapping in dozens of languages. The survivors couldn't turn away. One by one, they saw memories flicker behind their eyes, not their own, but his. The first knock, years ago, when the voices whispered to a child hiding under his bed. The second as a young man curled in a Ridgeview cell, hands swollen, nails torn free. The 1000th knock, each one slower, weaker, as he begged unseen forces for mercy. "They're inside me," he had written once. "I can't tell where they end, and I begin." In that moment, the survivors understood. Patient 43 had not been a hero. He had been a vessel, a cage barely holding back the thing that now spread through the house like wildfire. The figure's head jerked up. Its eyes were hollow voids, and from them poured a black mist that curled across the floor. The survivors staggered back as the whispers grew deafening. "You knock because you fear, but fear built these walls. You were never outside. You've been here all along." One survivor clutched their chest, sobbing. Their heartbeat felt wrong. 3 slow, echoing thuds where there should have been 4. Another felt their fingers twitching against their thigh, tapping in perfect rhythm though their minds screamed to stop. And then the figure began to rise. It moved in staccato jerks, as though unseen hands were puppeteering its limbs. With each step, its form grew taller, impossibly so, until it filled the room. Hands, hundreds of them, unfurled from its chest, each one pounding a different rhythm. The survivors fled, but every door they opened led only to more corridors, more knocking, more whispers. The house was no longer a maze. It was a body, and they were deep inside its lungs, choking on its breath. At 3:07 a.m., they heard it again, the colossal slam of a door closing far behind them. And this time, it wasn't a door to keep the voices out. It was to keep them in. The survivors didn't know how long they'd been running. Time didn't work properly here. Hours collapsed into seconds. Seconds stretched into lifetimes. Their feet slapped against floors that changed texture with every step. Marble, wood, cold flesh. Behind them came the sound of distant knocking, impossibly loud, echoing off walls that seemed to breathe. But it wasn't the knocking that terrified them most. It was the silence that followed. In those gaps they could hear footsteps, bare, wet, deliberate. The hollowed were close. At first, the hollowed had been human. They were the ones who had faltered in the ritual, who had stopped knocking long enough for the voices to slip through the cracks of their minds. Now they wandered these halls as empty vessels, their bodies grotesquely stretched and reshaped to fit the house's needs. Pale skin clung to sharp bones. Their heads lolled at unnatural angles. Knuckles were raw and bloodied, hands twitching endlessly in the air, as if still knocking on invisible doors. Some dragged their fingers along the walls, leaving trails of dark ichor that pulsed faintly, like veins in living tissue. The survivors tried to stay quiet, but the house punished silence. Their breaths sounded like roars in the vast corridors, each heartbeat a drumbeat, summoning the hollowed closer. A sudden noise, a sob, a boot scuff, would send them scattering into side passages. But the doors they found only led to more of the same. Endless halls, infinite rooms, staircases spiraling into voids. The architecture twisted like a predator playing with prey, offering paths that looped back upon themselves or led straight into crowds of hollowed, waiting with tilted heads and slack, smiling mouths. One survivor pressed an ear to a door, hoping to hear safety beyond. Instead, a voice spoke directly into their skull. They hear you breathing. They hear you thinking. They hear you knocking from the inside. Their hands shot up to cover their ears, but it was no use. The sound came from within, a rhythm echoing in bone and blood. Another survivor dropped to their knees mid-sprint, clutching their chest, as if to cage something trying to claw its way out. His final words were a whisper. "It's knocking. It wants out." Then his body collapsed inward, folding like paper, as the floor swallowed him whole. The hollowed were close enough now that the survivors could feel them, waves of heat and cold rolling down the halls like fever dreams. One figure emerged from the shadows ahead, impossibly tall and thin, its arms elongated until its hands dragged along the floor. It didn't run. It didn't need to. Every step it took pulled the walls closer, the hallway narrowing, as if the house itself wanted to deliver its prey. From behind, more hollowed approached, scores of them, moving in perfect unison, tapping their knuckles against walls with sickening precision. The sound rose to a deafening crescendo. Knock, 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 knock. In their panic, the survivors found a staircase spiraling downward, its steps slick and breathing. With no other choice, they descended, each footfall sinking slightly, as if stepping on a tongue. The air grew thicker, humid with the stench of decay. Here the walls were covered in hundreds of handprints, some large, others impossibly small, all pressed deep into the surface, as if trying to escape. At the base of the stairs was a door, unlike any other they had seen. It bore no handle, no hinges, just a faint impression of a face, its features slack with exhaustion. Patient 43. The survivors pressed their hands to the door, feeling its warmth, its pulse. A voice, not a whisper, but a roar, burst in their minds. "You've come this far because you're ready. Ready to stop knocking. Ready to open." Their hands moved without their consent, fingers curling into claws as they dug into the flesh-like surface. The door shuddered. Beneath their feet, the house seemed to inhale, and from the shadows above, the hollowed descended. The door pulsed beneath their hands, the faint outline of patient 43's face warping with each throb. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, eyes rolling as if trapped in endless nightmare. The survivors pressed harder, their palms sinking into the warm, pliant surface. The voice inside their heads was no longer a whisper, but a command that vibrated in their teeth. "Open. Let them through." Knuckles cracked as their hands dug deeper, and the door began to peel away, not as wood might splinter, but as flesh might tear. A sound like wet paper ripping echoed through the corridor, followed by a rush of hot air that smelled of rot and old earth. The survivors staggered back as the darkness beyond the door seemed to breathe, a vast black lung exhaling centuries of hunger. Within the void lay a room, a perfect replica of patient 43's Ridgeview cell, yet impossibly large, stretching endlessly in all directions. The walls were lined with countless doors, each bearing a number. Behind each door came soft, steady knocks, 3 at a time. Perfect rhythm. The survivors stepped inside, drawn as if by unseen strings. They recognized some of the numbers: birth dates, hospital IDs, apartment numbers. Each door was a reflection of themselves, and as they walked, faint voices began to leak through the cracks, their own voices whispering fears they thought long buried. One survivor approached a door marked with their childhood address. The knocking from within grew frantic as they neared, and a familiar voice cried out, "Please, I can't hold them back anymore. Help me knock." Their hand hovered over the knob. Deep down, they knew this was a trap, but another voice, the house's voice, slid into their mind, seductive and cold. "You don't have to knock anymore. You're tired. Let us take the weight." Fingers twitched toward the knob. The others screamed for them to stop, but their own mouths formed alien words in response. "I'm ready." The door swung open, and for a moment the survivor's body froze, silhouetted against the darkness beyond. Then they began to change. Skin grayed, limbs lengthened, joints cracking as bone warped. Their eyes sank into black hollows. The knocking stopped. In its place came a low, wet, scratching sound as their fingers began to twitch against their thigh. They turned back to the group with a slack smile and spoke in a voice layered with thousands of others. "The walls need builders." Panic rippled through the remaining survivors. They fled deeper into the chamber, doors slamming shut behind them. But the knocking never stopped. It grew louder, faster, overlapping until it was no longer a rhythm but a storm. Above them, the ceiling cracked open, revealing a yawning void. From it descended the hollowed, hundreds of them, their bodies writhing like puppets on tangled strings. Their hands struck every surface they passed, raising a deafening chorus of knocks that made the walls shudder and warp. The survivors realized too late that they were running in circles. Each path led them back to the same central chamber, to the same impossible cell, to the same door bearing patient 43's face. But now his mouth was moving, and his voice filled the air, not from his throat but from every wall, every floorboard, every breath. "You are the next." The floor gave way beneath them. They fell through endless layers of rooms, corridors, staircases, all stacked like vertebrae in some colossal spine. As they plummeted, they saw themselves reflected in windows and mirrors scattered through the void, each reflection twisted and wrong, each version of themselves already hollowed, their hands ceaselessly tapping at invisible doors. The house had been patient. It had learned their rhythms, their weaknesses, their fears, and now it was ready to use them to grow. When they landed, they found themselves standing not on solid ground but on a vast, breathing plain made of interlocked human hands. Each hand twitched weakly, knuckles cracking in 1,000 overlapping beats. Above, the house loomed infinite, its windows glowing faintly with pale faces pressed against the glass. A single voice rose from the mass below, calm and certain. "You've knocked long enough. Rest now. Become the walls." There was no sunrise anymore, only the steady dimming of the sky as it folded inward. Cities lay silent beneath a false firmament of plaster and wood, clouds hardening into ceiling panels streaked with water damage. Roads cracked and curled, transforming into hallways that stretched for miles, lined with doors that never opened. From the ruins of skyscrapers, faint knocking could be heard, window panes vibrating in sync, the sound echoing like the heartbeat of a god that had finally woken. The house was no longer a place, it was the world, and there was no way out. The survivors, if they could still be called that, were scattered across this new architecture, their bodies and minds straining under the weight of assimilation. Some still clung to the ritual, fists pounding against any surface they could find. But the knocks were weaker now, uneven, like dying heartbeats. Others had stopped entirely, their hands hanging limp at their sides as their eyes glazed over. You could always tell when someone had given in. Their fingers would begin to twitch unconsciously, rapping against thighs, walls, even their own teeth in a slow, deliberate rhythm. And once they started, they never stopped. Patient 43's voice haunted the survivors' minds, not as a memory, but as an echo woven into the house's very bones. I held it back as long as I could, he whispered endlessly. But the walls were never strong enough. You were never outside. You were always inside. Those who remembered his journals now realized the horrible truth. Every knock they had made in their lives, on doors, tables, windows, had been part of the house's slow expansion. Each sound was a seed planted, each hesitation a crack for the voices to slip through. In this new reality, geography was meaningless. Landmarks had become absurd parodies of themselves, parks that looped endlessly, bridges that stretched into black voids, rivers that flowed along hallways before vanishing beneath locked doors. Survivors spoke of seeing their childhood homes at the ends of long corridors, only to find them filled with strangers' memories. Sometimes they heard familiar voices calling from behind doors, mothers, lovers, children. But those who opened the doors never returned. The others could only listen as frantic knocking began from the other side, fading as the person was pulled deeper into the house's anatomy. The hollowed roamed freely now. They no longer hunted with urgency. They didn't need to. Instead, they wandered the halls in endless processions, their hands dragging along the walls, leaving trails of dark, glistening ichor. Each step they took reshaped the corridors, extending them, twisting them, making the house larger. It became clear that they were not just victims. They were the house's architects, their broken minds and bodies serving as tools for its endless construction. And soon the survivors feared they too would join the work. Some survivors found themselves embedded in walls, only their faces visible, their mouths opened and closed soundlessly, tears tracing down cheeks that could no longer move. From deep within, muffled knocking reverberated, as if their hands were still trying to reach the surface. Others became doors themselves, their skin stretched across frames, eyes staring out from peepholes, as faint whispers leaked from beneath their thresholds. They had become what Patient 43 warned of, the next doors, and all the while, the voices grew louder, filling every corner of every mind. "You've knocked long enough," they sang in unison. "Now let us knock for you." At 3:07 a.m., the time no one could escape, there came a sound unlike any other. Not the sharp, deliberate taps of ritual, but a colossal, resonant knock so powerful it shook the world. Survivors fell to their knees as cracks spread across reality itself, light bleeding through like the glow of a dying sun. The house had found the first crack in existence. It was coming through. The walls were never silent anymore. Beneath the faint thrum of the house's heartbeat came muffled sounds, screams, sobs, the frantic thudding of fists. The survivors who had resisted too long were now trapped within, their bodies fused into wood and plaster, faces stretched across panels, mouths opening and closing in soundless terror. But inside those static forms, fragments of consciousness still burned, faint and flickering. They weren't truly gone. Not yet. In the darkness behind their eyelids they fought, clawing at invisible barriers, pounding with what remained of their hands against the suffocating embrace of the house. One remembered her daughter's laughter. She clung to it like a lifeline, the memory playing on an endless loop as the voices pressed closer. "She's already here," they whispered sweetly. "We saved her for you." Open the door and see. But she refused. Every time they spoke, she slammed the door in her mind, knowing that even a glance would be her undoing. Knocking became her only tether to reality. Though she had no hands left to strike with, she knocked with her mind instead, sending slow, steady rhythms through the cracks of her prison. Somewhere in the endless corridors, a faint answering knock echoed back. Another survivor had been part of the house for so long, he had almost forgotten his own name. His body was now a support beam, his arms fused to ceiling rafters like twisted roots, but his heart still beat, faintly, and he could hear its rhythm. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause. The ritual persisted in his chest, resisting assimilation. The voices hated it. They whispered venom, mocking his memories, twisting them until even his most sacred moments felt false. You're not real. You're just a memory the house keeps warm. But he kept knocking anyway, his thoughts echoing like faint hammer blows against the wood that had become his skin. Elsewhere, deeper within the house, survivors who had not yet been absorbed huddled together in shifting corridors. They had no way of knowing if their companions were still alive or merely trapped in the walls around them. Sometimes they heard voices calling from cracks in the plaster, pleading to be pulled free. But the voices always shifted midway, becoming something colder, crueler. "Help us," they would whisper before morphing into snarls. "Let us out. Let us in. Let us wear you." The survivors learned to ignore them, though each plea left scars in their minds. Patient 43's presence was stronger here. His voice had grown louder, not as a savior's, but as a warning woven into every creak of the floorboards. "They'll strip you down to bone and memory. They'll use your face on the next door. You are the nails now. You are the wood." The few who still held hope believed they could find his original cell, if such a place still existed in this impossible architecture, and reignite the ritual from its source. But every attempt to navigate toward it ended in circles. Hallways looped endlessly, rooms folded back upon themselves, and stairways descended into voids that whispered in 1,000 voices. No more knocking, just opening. The house was evolving faster now. Its corridors pulsed like veins, walls flexing with each beat of its colossal heart. Windows appeared on every surface, ceilings, floors, even within walls themselves. Behind each pane of glass, pale faces stared with hollow eyes, mouths twitching in silent, frenzied knocking. Some survivors who stared too long at these windows felt their own reflections reach out to grab them. A few vanished entirely, pulled screaming into the glass as their bodies left faint, bloody smears on the frames. The hollowed moved differently in this new reality. They no longer stalked or hunted. They drifted like dust motes in a shaft of light, their hands trailing against walls as they whispered to the house in languages no human could understand. When they passed by survivors, their heads turned unnaturally, eyes rolling toward the sound of hearts still beating out of sync with the house's rhythm. Survivors learned to hold their breath when the hollowed came close, praying their slowed pulses wouldn't betray them. And yet, even in this suffocating prison, resistance lingered. Every night, if nights could still be measured, small vibrations ran through the halls, faint knocks. Survivors trapped within walls and floors sent desperate messages to each other. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Their shared rhythm spread through the house like a hidden artery, a ghostly defiance against the growing dominion of the voices. For now, it was only a whisper in the house's vast consciousness, but whispers the survivors hoped could still become screams. The remaining survivors called it the crawl. They didn't know if they were moving forward, downward or in endless circles, but still they pressed on. Hallways narrowed until they were forced to drag themselves on elbows and knees, the walls so close they could feel heat radiating from within. Sometimes the surfaces flexed against their bodies like breathing flesh. Other times faint vibrations rippled beneath their palms, a slow, deliberate knock that seemed to come from deep below. It was impossible to tell whether it was a sign of life or a warning. Either way, they had no choice but to follow. Their journey blurred time into a haze. Days or hours might have passed. There was no way to measure. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but worse than that was the thirst. Every so often they found puddles seeping from cracks in the floorboards, slick and black as oil. Some drank out of desperation. The ones who did began to change. At first it was subtle, their fingers twitching unconsciously in slow rhythms, but soon their eyes dulled, voices flattening into toneless murmurs that echoed faintly, with other voices layered underneath. They continued to crawl, but no longer spoke, their movements becoming mechanical, synchronized. The others knew these were no longer their companions, but hollowed in the making. As they pressed deeper, the house's architecture became increasingly alien. Corridors spiraled in impossible geometries, gravity shifting so that walls became floors, ceilings became hallways. Doors appeared and disappeared, their frames made of knotted bone, their handles of twisted knuckles. Some survivors dared to peek behind these doors. What they saw drove them to madness. Entire cities shrunk to the size of rooms, streets folding like origami, oceans pressed flat against cracked wallpaper. The house wasn't just expanding, it was consuming. Every layer of reality peeled back became another hallway, another door, another surface for the voices to inhabit. At last they reached a threshold unlike any they had seen. A door loomed before them, massive, stretching so high, its top was lost in darkness. It was made entirely of interlocked human hands, their knuckles bruised and bleeding from endless knocking. Faces peeked out between the fingers, whispering pleas in 100 languages. "Don't open, don't let him in." But beneath those whispers came another voice, calm, steady, and horribly familiar. "You've already opened it." Every knock was a key. The door began to tremble, as though sensing their presence. Knocks rolled like thunder from the other side, each impact shaking the survivors' bones. The voice spoke again, louder now, filling their minds until their own thoughts drowned. "You came to see me. I never left. I've been knocking for you all this time." The sound of countless locks disengaging echoed from within. The survivors turned to flee, but the corridor behind them had vanished, replaced by an endless wall of eyes. Each one blinked in unison, and from their depths came that same voice. "Why run? You're already here." The door swung open. Inside was a chamber that defied comprehension, an infinite space, yet claustrophobically close. The walls were covered in veins of pulsing light, and at the center stood a figure. Or perhaps it had once been a figure. Patient 43 had become a monument of bone and sinew. His body stretched into the foundation of the chamber itself. Hands sprouted from his torso in tangled clusters, each one knocking in its own rhythm. His face was fused to the ceiling, eyes wide and unblinking as his mouth worked ceaselessly. "Keep them out. Keep them out. Keep them out." The survivors realized too late that this was not a prison for patient 43, but his throne. The voices had never wanted to escape. They had wanted to expand. Patient 43 had been their first door, and now they needed new ones. The survivors felt it then, a deep ache in their bones. a pull in their chests, as their hearts began to synchronize with the knocking. Hands erupted from the floor beneath them, clawing at their legs, their chests, their throats, and patient 43's voice, now joined with thousands more, whispered the truth. There are no walls, there are only doors. You are all doors. There was no sky anymore, no ground, no horizon. The house had consumed them all, folding continents into hallways, oceans into stairwells, and cities into endless, windowless rooms. Above, where clouds once drifted, there were only ceilings lined with faintly glowing light fixtures. Below, streets had been replaced with breathing floors that pulsed like the inside of a living lung. Reality wasn't just warped, it was gone, and in its place, the house stretched infinitely in every direction, a maze without exit or center. The last surviving fragments of humanity drifted like sparks in a hurricane, each clinging to scraps of memory. Some remembered laughter, others held tightly to the sound of a loved one's voice. But these embers were smothered quickly, doused by the voices rising from every surface. You're home now. You were always home. The walls whispered it. The floors hummed it. Even the faint breeze that slipped through cracks carried the words. The few survivors who still retained their forms could feel their limbs stiffening, their fingers twitching involuntarily, in slow, deliberate knocks. It was no longer a question of if they would join the house, but when, within the walls, those already absorbed tried to speak. They tapped faint rhythms, desperate to reach anyone still outside. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause, but the house twisted their messages, warping them into meaningless cacophony. Sometimes, faint voices did break through, pleas carried like static on a broken radio. We're still here. Don't come. Don't knock. Please. But the messages never lasted. The house was a jealous thing. It did not permit communication beyond itself. The hollowed had grown into something else entirely. No longer mere extensions of the house. They now served as its custodians. They drifted through the endless corridors in great processions, their bodies fused with architecture, spines stretched into support beams, skulls embedded in walls, hands replacing door handles. Their knocking was no longer frantic but purposeful, like builders striking nails into wood. Every knock added a new room, a new hallway, a new door. The house was alive and growing, and it needed them to keep building. At the heart of it all lay patient 43, or what remained of him. His form had lost all human shape, transformed into a latticework of bone and sinew that spanned entire levels of the house. Hands erupted from every surface of his massive body, each one knocking in complex patterns that sent tremors through the structure. His face now stretched across an entire ceiling, wept black tears as it whispered endlessly. I tried to hold them back, but the knocking never stopped. The survivors who reached him understood too late. He had not been the jail, he had been the door. As the last fragments of humanity slipped away, they felt themselves pulled towards walls, their skin fusing to wood and plaster, their minds unraveling into whispers. One survivor, barely clinging to thought, made a final attempt to resist. From deep within a wall, she began to knock. 3 slow strikes. Pause. 3 more. Pause. Again and again, her rhythm echoed faintly through the endless halls. Somewhere far away, a child's voice whispered back, I hear you. But then the house tightened its grip. Her knocks slowed, faltered, stopped. Her voice became one among thousands, layered in the endless chorus. We are the walls, we are the doors, we are the house. And then came the sound. a single colossal knock that reverberated through infinity. It wasn't from the survivors, nor the hollowed, nor even patient 43. It came from beyond the house, from outside. Something was knocking to come in. The house fell silent, as if holding its breath. Then, with a sound like splintering bone, new doors began to bloom across its surface, millions of them, each glowing faintly. Behind every door came a new voice, eager, hungry, and patient. You knocked, now we answer. And so, the knocking never truly stopped. Some say if you press your ear to an old wooden wall late at night, you'll hear it. 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. Perhaps it's just the house settling, or perhaps it's patient 43, still trying to warn us. But if you hear a voice whisper, "You knocked, now we answer," don't reply. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales, subscribe to the channel. Join us as we uncover forgotten histories, dark secrets, and mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next knock at your door.